Hi, I'm Les Brown, and welcome back to So You Want to Write a Novel. Last time I mentioned that in this episode we were going to talk about a new web app that I'm developing, and there's bad news and good news. The bad news is we won't be able to work with it today. But the good news is we're building in a mess of new features that I'll tell you about next time. Today, I want to talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention, especially among younger writers, the nuts and bolts of writing, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. I know, not the most glamorous topics. When you're deep in the throes of building a world and breathing life into your characters, the last thing you want to think about is whether that comma belongs inside or outside the quotation marks. I get it. But here's what I've learned after writing 5 novels and working with professional editors. Getting the mechanics right isn't just some tedious chore you have to suffer through. It's actually one of the most important things I've done for my writing and for my stories. So let me share what I've found. Let's start with something that took me a while to figure out. Good grammar isn't really about following rules for the sake of following rules. It's about clarity of thought. When a sentence is grammatically sound, what that usually means is that the writer has thought clearly about what they want to say. The grammar is the evidence of that clear thinking. And conversely, when a sentence is tangled or ambiguous, it's almost always because the thought behind it is tangled or ambiguous. As fiction writers, we're asking our readers to enter a kind of dream state, to suspend disbelief and live inside the world we've created. Every time a reader stumbles over an awkward sentence or has to reread a paragraph to figure out what we meant, we've pulled them out of that dream. And once they're out, it's hard to get them back in. That's the real cost of sloppy mechanics. It's not that you've broken a rule, it's that you've broken the spell. I've heard writers say, my editor will clean it up. And technically, yes, that's part of what an editor does. But what I discovered working with my own editor is there's an enormous difference between an editor who's polishing your prose and an editor who's spending most of their time deciphering what you meant to say. When my editor was busy untangling my sentence structure, she wasn't spending that time on the things that truly elevate a manuscript: the pacing, the structure, the character arcs, the thematic depth. The things that turn a decent book into a really good one. I think of it this way. If you hired a master carpenter to build you a beautiful bookcase, you probably wouldn't hand him warped, splintered lumber and say, "You're the expert, sort it out." You'd want to give him the best material you could, and then let him make it extraordinary. And that's how I've come to think of the relationship with my editor. She's that master craftsman, and my clean manuscript is the quality lumber she needs to do her work. Now I want to address something I see a lot, especially in online writing communities. There's an attitude that grammar rules are outdated, that language evolves, voice matters more than correctness, and worrying about mechanics is somehow old-fashioned. And there's truth in that. Language does evolve. Voice absolutely matters. Cormac McCarthy didn't use quotation marks, and he won the Pulitzer Prize. But here's the part people leave out. McCarthy knew the rules intimately. His choices were deliberate and artistic. There's a universe of difference between breaking a rule on purpose because it serves your story and breaking it because you never learned it in the first place. I like to use Picasso as an analogy. Picasso could draw a technically perfect human figure. He chose to paint in the Cubist style. That's a fundamentally different thing from someone who can't draw a figure and calls it abstract art. Your readers can feel the difference, and your editor definitely can. Well, I bend the rules all the time in my own writing. I use sentence fragments for effect. I start sentences with and but. I occasionally use a comma splice when I want a particular rhythm. All of that is perfectly fine in fiction. The difference for me is that I'm making a choice, not making a mistake. Beyond the philosophical, there are some very practical things I've noticed over the course of writing 5 books. For one thing, editing costs real money, especially if you're self-publishing, as I am. I found that the cleaner my manuscript got before I sent them off, the faster and cheaper the editing process became. A manuscript riddled with mechanical problems may need an additional pass, a copy edit instead of just a line edit. And that adds up. So if you're watching your budget, it's worth thinking about. If you're querying agents or submitting to publishers, first impressions matter enormously. Your manuscript is competing with hundreds of others. An agent who opens your first chapter and spots basic errors in the first paragraph isn't likely to think, this writer has a unique voice. They're more likely to think, this writer didn't do the work. That may not be fair, but it's reality. But here's the one that surprised me most, and it's the reason I'm most passionate about this topic. As I got a better handle on how punctuation works, I started to hear the music in my sentences. I learned that a semicolon creates a different pause than a period, that an em dash creates a different energy from a comma, that where you break a paragraph changes how the reader breathes. Punctuation marks aren't just rules, they're instruments. And the more of them I learned to play, the richer my prose became. Let me share some of the most common issues I've run into, both in my own manuscripts and in what I see other writers dealing with, because these come up over and over again. The homophones, words that sound alike but are spelled differently. It's versus its. Your versus your. There versus there versus there. Everyone knows these, but they show up in every manuscript, including mine. Not because the writer doesn't know the difference, but because when you're in the flow, your fingers type the wrong one and your eyes skip right over it when you reread. And that's normal. That's human. But it helps to have a system to catch them. And I'll get to that in a moment. Affect versus effect. This one catches a lot of writers. Generally, affect is the verb and effect is the noun, though there are plenty of exceptions. Dialogue punctuation is another one that trips people up, and I'll admit it took me a while to get it down cold. The basic rule is straightforward. When a dialogue tag follows speech, the speech ends with a comma inside the quotation marks, not a period. "I don't think so," she said. Not, "I don't think so," she said. In the second version, "she said" is orphaned as a separate sentence, and it isn't one. Your dialogue tag is part of the same sentence as the dialogue itself. It seems like a small thing, but it's the kind of error that can signal to an agent or editor that a writer hasn't spent time with their craft. And question marks and exclamation marks work the same way. "Look out!" he shouted. Not, "Look out!" he shouted. The exclamation mark replaces the comma, but the dialogue tag still begins with a lowercase letter. Then there's the comma splice, joining two complete sentences with just a comma. "He ran to the door, she was already gone." That needs a period, a semicolon, or a conjunction. Now in fiction, you can sometimes use a comma splice deliberately for pace or rhythm. I do it myself. But once again, it has to be a conscious choice. The good news is there are tools available that can help you enormously. The one I want to talk about is Grammarly. This is not a sponsorship. Nobody's paying me to say this. I just think it's a genuinely useful tool, and it's made a real difference in my own workflow. Grammarly works as a browser extension, a desktop app, and it integrates with Word, Google Docs, and many other applications, including your favorite emailer. It catches the fundamentals, spelling, punctuation, subject-verb agreement, but it also flags things like passive voice overuse, unclear antecedents, and wordiness. The free version is surprisingly capable. The paid version goes much deeper. But here's the thing I didn't expect. For me, the real value of Grammarly hasn't just been catching mistakes. It's been learning. Every time it flagged something and explained why, that was a micro lesson. Over weeks and months of writing, I started to internalize those patterns. I stopped making the same errors. My first drafts got cleaner and faster. It was like having a patient, tireless tutor sitting alongside while I worked. Now, a word of caution. Grammarly doesn't understand fiction the way a human editor does. It will flag your deliberate fragments, your intentional comma splices, your character's regional dialect. That's fine. You simply ignore those suggestions. I think of it as a first line of defense and not the only one. What I do is run my manuscript through Grammarly, accept the suggestions that make sense, skip the ones that don't, and then send it to my editor. She thanked me for it more than once. Let me pull this together by sharing the workflow I've settled on after 5 books. It may not be right for everyone, but it worked well for me. First, I write freely, in longhand. When I'm drafting, I don't worry much about the gritty details. Since I write longhand anyway, there are no grammar police looking over my shoulder. I just get the story down. The creative work matters most at that stage, and nothing kills momentum faster than stopping to fuss over the correct spelling of a word. Then once the draft is done, I turn it into a Word document and let Grammarly have a go at it. I read it aloud to hear how my prose sounds. My ear catches things my eye misses, awkward phrasing, repeated words, sentences that run on too long. I found this to be one of the most underrated editing techniques out there, and I'd encourage anyone to try it. Then it goes to beta readers, a couple of people I trust. They catch things that both Grammarly and I missed, and they tell me where the story itself needs work. And finally, it goes to my professional editor. Because I've already done all of the above, she receives a clean manuscript and can focus on what she does best, making a good book better. I know this hasn't been the most exciting topic. No characters, no plot twists, no big emotional scenes. But those brilliant scenes you're writing deserve to be presented in the best possible way. For me, getting the mechanics right has become an act of respect. Respect for my readers, respect for my editor, and frankly, respect for my own work. I've poured years into these manuscripts. I want to give them every advantage I can. Nobody's perfect at this stuff. I'm certainly not. But learning the basics and using the tools available has made an enormous difference in my writing, and I think it's worth the effort for anyone who's serious about the craft. Next time, I hope we'll get a chance to look at my new web app, NovelBank, and see a valuable tool authors can use for storing and organizing their research and keeping track of all those fussy details that give us authors so much of a headache. That episode will be coming soon, so watch for it. Thanks for listening, and keep writing.